Okay, we're in chapter 2 now, and so I'm going to go over section 2.1 and just walk through some of the examples in the chapter and explain what's going on here. For the purposes of this video, I've created a new Java project called chapter 2. I've created a new package called chapter 2, all lowercase one word. And inside of that, I've added one class right now, and that's just called section examples. And I'm going to reuse that to go through each section of the textbook. But that's the same procedure you would use to set up your assignments, so you can follow that if you want to. Okay, we're talking about variables here at the start, and a variable is a way for a program to keep track of information. And so to create a variable and use it, you need three parts. You need a type, and that could be things like string or integer. You need a name, which is a unique identifier. So it can't have the same name as something else. It's got to have its own unique name. And it's got to have a value or contents inside of it. And so here's some examples of what that might look like. If I want to keep track of your age, I would create an integer, and I'd use the term int. That's how we create integers in Java and most programming languages. Int, and then I need to give it a name, so we'll call this one age. And then to give it contents, I say equals, and I give it a number. Okay. If I was going to create a string, which is just text or anything that you can put in quotation marks, keyboard symbols. You can put numbers in there too. I need to start with the type, and the type would be string with a capital letter. String, my name, and then in quotes I would put just like that. Now the reason that int can be lowercase and string needs to be capitalized is because string is a type that is based on a class, whereas an int is a primitive type of data. So those are details we'll get to eventually, but for now just remember int has to be lowercase, string has to be capitalized. String is more complicated. It does things. It's got the ability to copy itself and sorts of things like that. Integer is a dumb object. It just doesn't do anything except hold a value. So anyway, I don't have to give it a content for this to be legal. So I could say int another number, semicolon, and that's legal. There's nothing in it, so it's not really useful, but I could put something into it later. So later on in my code, I might say another number equals 7, and then it's used, okay? Now, the reason we're getting these warnings here is there's not anything wrong with them. It's just that we haven't used them in the program yet, and so until we make use of them, we get that kind of a warning. So that's normal. So I'm going to delete those two for a second here. Another thing you can do is, we've sent things out to the console window using print stream. So for example, I could say system.out.println, and then I can send age into that command, and I can say system.out.println, and I can send my name to that one, or I could put in something totally new, system.out.println, hi there. Okay, and if I run that, all of those will execute. And we'll see 10 for age, Nate for the name, and hi there for that literal string I typed in. Well, system.out is an object, and it's an object of type printStream. And so we can create our own version of system.out if you want to. You could say printStream my output, we'll call it that, equals, and we just say system.out. Okay. Now this will give us an error right now, and the reason is if I click on the error, printStream cannot be resolved to a type. It doesn't have the information it needs to create a new printStream object, and so what we'd have to do is actually choose the first suggestion on this pop-up window, which is import printstream java.io. IO stands for input output. So I can click on that or double click it, and it automatically imports the correct file. And now I can create printStream objects. And so all that means is, instead of saying system.out, I could just say my output.println. Okay, so that works just like system.out.println. There you go. So all of these are the three-part option here. So you have a type, a name, and a value. And you have a type, a name, and a value. And so it's that same pattern over and over and over again. And you'll get used to seeing that. Now, it's important when you're working with variables that you really understand what you're putting into them. So if I were to create an int, and then let's say in my head what I'm really thinking is I want to put my name in there, but I used an int, and then I say int my name. Okay, so far there's no problem because you can name it whatever you want to, and the computer doesn't check and say, wait a minute, this isn't a name. So that's okay. But if I try to put quotation marks in here and say my name, now we've got a problem because integers can't hold strings. They can only hold numbers. So the only thing I can put there is like a 10 or a 15 or something like that. And that actually is legal. So the error should clear there in just a second. So I could system.out.println. The reason I'm getting an error is because I used my name already. That's what I used up here. I just forgot. Okay, so we'll call this one some name. And I'll put some name here. Okay, and that is totally fine. Even though it's called some name, it's an integer and it's holding a number value, so that's okay. Obviously, the problem there is that's a confusing thing to call it if it's a number, right? And so that's just to prove it works, I'll hit the run button and you can see it prints out 10 just fine. But that's a bad habit. And so when you're creating variables, think about what type of data do I need and what's a good name for it. So if it's a number, it should be an int. We'll get into this later, but if it's a decimal place number, you know, like a tax rate or the number pi, you want to use what's called a float variable. Okay, that's a floating point. If you're doing a name, you want to use a string. So just make sure you use the right type with the right type of data. Now, names are important as well. So name it what it is or what it does. I always have programming students who like to name things string 1 and string 2 and string 3. And that's bad because the name 1, 2, 3 doesn't tell me anything about what this string should contain. Now you might be able to keep track of 3 things that aren't named correctly. But as your programs get larger, I guarantee you'll forget what things are causing what errors. And you know, when you're out of the context and you see these errors popping up and 1, 2, or 3 isn't working for you, you'll forget which one refers to what. So always name things what they are or what they do. And don't name them silly things like, I don't know, zippity doo-dah. Okay, I get students that like to do that too. It's funny, I guess, maybe, but it doesn't make any sense and it doesn't tell you what it is or what it does. So stick to names that identify its job and its purpose. So first name is a great name for a string because that tells you what's inside of it. Okay, so we'll stick to that. That was supposed to go down in this part. Okay. Now, naming rules. You can't just name it whatever you want to. So I'll use int as an example. Variables have to start with should start with a lowercase letter. Classes like string start with a capital letter, but variable names should start with lowercase letters. So int should start with lowercase. You cannot start with a number. Okay, so that's a bad one. First number. that's an illegal statement. You can't name it with the number 1 or any kind of number or symbol there. It has to start with a lowercase letter. So you could do first number, and that would make more sense. Okay, and that works. You can't put any spaces in variable names because the computer thinks these are 2 separate objects. And also, capitalization totally matters. So if I create another one called int first number with a lowercase n, that's legal. These are 2 different names to the computer because capital N and lowercase n are different letters to the computer. And that is confusing. So if you have first number and first number, that's going to cause all kinds of problems for you mentally as you're trying to figure out what's wrong with your program if you have errors. So don't do that, but understand that you have to name things consistently. So if you spell something one way, you got to keep spelling it that way later on. You also can't use reserved words. So let's say I wanted to have a string and I wanted to call it int for some reason. It's not going to work. Or out. Also not a good idea. So different things that are reserved. String float. Okay, you can't use that one because it's a reserved keyword. So there are certain words that it won't let you use, and it'll give you warnings. So that should be pretty easy to avoid. Okay, now sometimes it's not against the law technically, but it's just bad practice. So I might say something like string okay, and that is legal, but it's bad because a variable should start with a lowercase letter. So even though it says this is fine to use, that's bad practice. And if I see it while you're doing it, I'll point that out. It's a problem. You shouldn't do it that way. And that's not just a matter of preference. That's Java naming conventions. Everybody that programs with Java will tell you that's how you're supposed to do it. And if you do that on the test, the AP test, you get marked down, obviously. So that's important to know as well. Okay, that I think wraps it up for section 2.1. So you should be able to answer the self-check questions on page 36 based on that information.